I'm Besa Luce, and welcome to K2.0's podcast, Other Talking Points. In this episode, I will be exploring the lives and political struggles of trans people in the region. I find this topic particularly important, considering that trans identities are often marginalized, misunderstood, or rejected. This is not necessarily an experience limited to this region. Attempts to keep trans lives in the margins is something occurring globally. Nevertheless, there is a lot of knowledge and documentation of the multilayered histories of trans existence and activist engagement. This is precisely what is brought to the surface in the recently published book, Transgender in the Post-Yugoslav Space: Lives, Activisms, Culture, edited by Bojan Bilić, Ivor Nord, and Aleksa Milanović. The book gathers 12 contributors from different professional backgrounds, such as academia, activism, and art, who offer important documentation of trans lives and activism. The contributors take on the difficult task of documenting histories largely kept in the margins. As I was going through the book, I experienced it as an important document resisting the tendencies to erase. Moreover, I think it opens up new ways to question current articulations about trans lives. And most importantly, I believe it has the potential to open new avenues for stronger regional solidarity to oppose political violence and hate speech against trans persons. To discuss the book, and particularly the political context in which it was published, I will be talking to one of its editors, Aleksa Milanović, as well as with one of the book's contributors, Lura Limani. Aleksa Milanović is an assistant professor at the Faculty of Media and Communications in Belgrade. He holds a PhD in transdisciplinary studies of contemporary arts and media. He's also the author of Representation of Transgender Identities in Visual Arts and Media Construction of Other Body. Lura Limani is a researcher, editor, and activist. She worked as the editor-in-chief of Pristina Insight. She holds an MA in Cultural Studies. Aleksa, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you for inviting me here.
Lura, thanks for being here as well.
Thank you so much for having us.
So, Aleksa, I would like to begin with you. And as I was going through the book, I was actually thinking about how producing knowledge is a great responsibility, be it in terms of selecting the stories that we tell, but then also who tells those stories, I think is also very critical. I think this becomes all the more difficult maybe when putting together a book about lives that are often neglected or misunderstood. So as one of the editors of this book, I'm interested to know what was it like for you to bring together different contributors while ensuring they all maintain that element of responsibility, so that element of care about what is being said and how it is being said?
I must say that academically, I think this book is important because the authors are part of trans community or are allies who are connected to the community in various ways. So in this way, first of all, we ensured the use of adequate terminology. And why this is important? This is important because terminology and definitions related to trans issues are changing very quickly and are constantly improving. The community in general, not only here, is constantly finding ways to overcome this pathologization and dehumanization of trans people, and that process is slow. However, if you compare the terminology used by activists 10 years ago and now, you will see that it differs. So it was very important for us to be up to date with terminology, and we could do it only if we consult the community, the trans activists and allies who are deeply involved in trans issues in this region. Here in this book, we have up-to-date terminology, which is adequate, which respects people and their identities, which reflects our lives, and feelings without connecting them to pathology. Another important thing we have ensured in this book, with the selection of people who contributed to this book, is that people who are part of the community talked about their lives and their activism. Therefore, we are introducing a new practice here in academia in this region, where in one academic publication, we have trans people from these areas who talk about their lives, about their problems they face. And until now, here in our region, in academic context, you could meet only analysis of people who are not part of the community and who deal with this topic out of some curiosity on, academic curiosity or personal curiosity. So it was very important for us to introduce, to have authors who are part of the community or are important allies of this community. So I think that we achieved that goal pretty good, even though it was hard actually to, people who are in activism here, in trans activism are, overwhelmed with activist work because of the high degree of transphobia in this region. So they do not have time and privilege to sit and write on a text for a few months and,
Yeah, and Lura, actually, I think you came to this book as an ally of the community. And I think what you bring to it is so important because you bring this story that was very much unheard of a transgender person from the 80s in Kosovo. And I found very interesting that you first heard of this story through discussions with your mother and your aunt. And I think this brings a very important element, that how there could be many trans stories that are kept in the private space and that do not move necessarily in the public sphere. And while the story that you came across, it was something that was also covered in one of the daily newspapers in the 80s in Pristina, in Kosovo. But when I was reading your text about how the story of the transgender person was covered in the 80s, it was very clear that there was also limitations in knowledge and in language in terms of how trans identity at the time was discussed and was understood. So can you speak maybe about the importance of documentation and how should stories from the past be read, understood, or even situated in today's context?
Yeah, I mean, as Aleksa mentioned, I think this book really contributes with that because it expands the notion of what an academic book can do. And it is very centered in trans people and trans lives. And that is how I came to this book as well. I was recommended by trans activists in Kosovo who, exactly as Aleksa explained, are super busy with fighting transphobia every day, that they do not have the actual mental space even, and definitely not the time to sit down and produce the knowledge for the community, the knowledge that must be produced, because as you said, and as you kind of indicated, documentation is key to creating this knowledge of a history of not necessarily just identity building, but also of the shifts, the oppression that happens, and of the progress that is made through the years, which is definitely in our region overall has been very little documented. And again, when we look at the area of trans studies overall globally, it's not, it doesn't have a long history academically speaking, right? Although what we're seeing now is studies that do look towards the past exactly with this notion of not rebranding everything as new or recent, because that is actually, unjust and wrong. And I think similarly, that is also how I approached the topic. Because for me, and mostly this is as a kind of, as a renegade cultural studies scholar, I think for me what was interesting is exactly this point of like everybody knows something and then nobody knows anything specific about something. So I think we, in Kosovo in particular, we were raised, and this is the case with everywhere in Yugoslavia, you were raised with models of trans icons. I mean, they were part of our pop culture, but they were not seen as part of our own culture. So like you had pop, like Turkish pop culture, or, even further than that. So you were not necessarily unfamiliar with the notion, but it was always considered as something foreign. And so for me, it was interesting when I was talking to people during the research process that not that there were trans people from Kosovo from the 60s or the 70s or the 80s, but actually that there were media coverage of a specific person, namely Mrs. Krasnice, who transitioned in 1978. And so what for me was fascinating was exactly this notion that documentation goes a long way, but it's also limited if it's actually not represented as part of a wider narrative and if we don't connect the dots. And this happens even in post-war Kosovo, where you do have more access to archives and you have access to nowadays to the internet, right? So like even today, if we would be writing something or talking about some specific issue, we often don't go back to look for the context of it or like look at things in a wider historical context, but we frame them as something separate from each other and as new. And this is the case also in this specific case. We have the reemergence of trans narratives in the public eye. And again, I'm saying only on a media and public eye, because I'm not saying that these narratives did not exist and were not pervasive in the private sphere, but we're looking at the public sphere. You have a reemergence in the 2010s, and then this has it has like this proclivity or inertia to rebrand this is the only time that we have appearance of trans people in public. And although this was not my original intention with the research, I think it was one of the main findings that exactly because we don't do the homework, and I'm not saying, and I'm judging mostly journalists and media, which, as you know, I feel a part of and a member of. We don't do the research and we don't contextualize the things that we cover in a way that makes sense, provides the actual fair context, and provides a narrative that would explain and would actually do improve the situation in how we understand trans issues today. Because I think it matters a lot to people, especially in the community. And I recently presented finally the chapter part of within a school for gender studies and sexuality studies. And I think it really matters to the community to learn these narratives that they don't have access to because nobody contextualizes their narratives in a longer spectrum of time. I don't know if this makes sense.
No,
and so this is,
yeah.
No, it totally makes sense. And actually, just to connect to this criticism that you do in your text about this tendency of claiming events as the first, that is also, of course, problematic in the way that historical narratives are built and how history is written and potentially remembered. Do you think that this discourse also contributes to trans people still being perceived as the other, as the new, precisely when we place it in the context of so-called firsts?
Yeah. So to kind of maybe like simplify it for the sake of the audience, or like almost like make it a bit banal, there is a tendency to perceive, human rights issues as issues of trans. And it is really important to understand that trans issues that are super relevant right now are not just a trend. And this is not something new. And this is exactly what we need to break down.
Aleksa, in the introduction of the book, together with the two other editors, you write a particularly noteworthy section, which is called Making Books, Making Ourselves. What does it mean to make oneself? How does that process take place? How did it take place within the context of this particular book?
Actually, it is, I will speak in my names because I am, in the same time, I am a trans activist and I am also a researcher who is a part of the academia. And both positions are very, very important for me personally. And my positions are important in the context of this book. Actually, I'm involved in activism since 2008 here in Serbia and in the region. And since that year, I volunteered for numerous activist organizations and informal LGBTIQ groups. I'm also participated in founding of Trans Network Balkan, which is a regional trans organization, and I'm a part of a collective Talastir, which is local organization here. But in the same time, I'm working as a academic, as a researcher, and I'm engaged in scientific research work, in which I mainly deal with the body studies and transgender studies. And both positions are very important for me because those positions are connected. I am an academic because I first became activist, and I was interested in a theory because I realized that maybe only through academia I could contribute to my community and to improve the position of trans people, to do research work and to speak differently about trans issues in my country and in this region. So I think that this book is actually maybe one of the important points of my life where I connect both. I connected my scientific work as an editor here and as an author, and my activist work I became part of this book as a person who is situated here in a community. Because main editor Bojan, he's not a part of a trans community, he's an ally. Ivo Nord is a part of trans community, but he's not from this context, he's from Nordic context. But I was a person who was connected with the local and regional trans community here, and I connected all those people with this book. Of course, Bojan also know, for example, he invited Alura to write for this book and some other people, but I think that my contribution was mainly activist here, and then academic. So while working on this book, my personal growth could be traced in that activist line and that line as a scholar. So this is I could say this is my first book with a lot of authors. So this is a kind of a starting point for next books about this topic.
It's interesting because you bring here this discussion, Aleksa. I think because you're talking about yourself as an activist and an academic, and there's a lot of discussion about these two being somehow distant to one another. And at the same time, there's a call to bring them closer. How do you see the relationship between academia and activism evolving? In what types of spaces or actions can they interact more with one another, inform one another more? Because sometimes they tend to be seen as separate, but there are ways where they also feed into one another. How do you see that?
I think that maybe this book is maybe it was an opportunity, and we achieved it to connect activism and academia, which is two different spheres because of their different practice. And in this region, and I think maybe globally, activists are not connected enough to academia, and academia is not connected enough with activism. And I think this is wrong, actually, because those two spheres must inform each other, especially in this field of topic, in transgender studies, in queer studies. You must be connected with the community because only on that way you could be, informed about adequate terminology, about what is happening in real life, actually. And I think that those two spheres should be intertwined in numerous ways. But I must say that this book is not a beginning of a knowledge production in trans community in this region, because we as a trans community, we are already producing a lot of publications annually. And activist organizations in this region publish manuals, analysis of media reporting about transgender issues and transgender people. My organization, Talas, recently published research related to the position of trans community during COVID pandemic. Soon we will publish research about accessibility of public spaces in Serbia. Also, I must mention very, very important publication by Spectra from Montenegro, a trans organization, and that publication is from 2020. Title of that publication is Community Self-Organizing of Transgender Movement in Western Balkan Region. Content of this publication consists of 6 articles whose respective authors are from trans activists from North Macedonia, Kosovo, Montenegro, Serbia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Albania. So each of these articles represents a personal view of one's own activist work. And of course, both history and current situation in those countries. And this is very, very important publication, but this is activist publication. And that kind of publications do not have adequate reach. They often doesn't reach to academic community, and they are, circulating in only activist contexts. So I hope actually that we will continue to produce more academic publications which are, connected with the community, to produce more books and texts.
But I think also this book and the way I approached it, at least, I think it also provides a very good theoretical framework, if I may say, in terms of how we approach conversations around trans lives and trans existence. And one critique in particular that I found very important was criticizing this tendency, what we've become more and more accustomed to, of importing, if I may say, knowledge produced in the perceived center, the West, to the so-called periphery of how we are treated, how we are communicated to as a region. And I think that theoretical framework of having a different kind of agency in how we approach knowledge, what kind of relationship we create with that, with the knowledge that is being produced, was very important for me in this book, because unfortunately, maybe throughout, let's say, more academic institutions in our region, if you look at the public universities, very often they tend to be terrains where there's a lot of misogyny, there's a lot of homophobia, there's a lot of racism. So how do you see potentially in the longer run the role of public education institutions in actually transforming themselves as well? How can books like this enter those domains, those public institutions?
I must say that now I'm not so optimistic about that, because if you look at the news, especially in Serbia, we have a big debate about books for high schools here, and they are retracted from use because they book from biology book is contained definition of what transgender is and what intersexual is and what LGBT acronym means. So our right-wing parties have objections on that. They wanted to remove those books from schools, and they succeeded in it. So I'm not optimistic in this moment that we will that we will have some improvement about transgender acceptance in education and in academia also.
Jura, how about you? How do you see this, I guess, in the context of Kosovo? And I was just thinking also about some of the conversations that took place this year in Kosovo with regard to the civil code, because at the beginning of the year, there was a session at the assembly. There was a discussion over the new civil code of Kosovo, which amongst many other things also included an article that did not recognize same-sex marriage, but just opened the prospects of a law being made sometime in the future for recognizing unions between same-sex couples. What was very misfortune. The civil code has not yet passed to this date, and I think it also wasn't very well received by activists, by human rights activists either, because it failed to recognize the right to same-sex marriage. But at the same time, what we witnessed at the beginning of the year at the Assembly was a very hateful, very homophobic discussion that took place amongst MPs from all political parties in Kosovo. But it was, now I'm trying resisting to say one of the first times, because I don't know if it was or not, but we did see a reaction from the Department of Psychology and Sociology from University in Pristina, who came out with a statement condemning the language that was used at the Assembly. And it's not something that happens that often, I would say, in Kosovo, and especially not with regards to, let's say, LGBT rights or trans rights in particular. So similarly with the question to Aleksa, how do you see our institutions, public educational institutions, transforming in this regard? How can potentially books like this or different corporations, also with civil society organizations, contribute to a new conversation and a new knowledge starting to be produced, but also embraced?
I mean, I'm also not very optimistic about the change that can happen in public universities or in schools in general, in the public education sector. But I do feel that activists are really engaged to fight these battles. And the little bit of kind of progress that we're witnessing in particular now with the University of Pristina's sociology and psychology departments are due to actual engagement by activists, due to students being also themselves more actively involved in human rights discussions and debates, being part of the community, and also creating safe spaces within these departments, but that are sort of at this point in time quite based or quite supported by singular people rather than systems and processes. So what is really scary right now is that I feel that there has been progress made in particular departments, but that's been because there are specific professors and assistant professors and lecturers who are human rights advocates and who are using their position of power to leverage a bit of creating safe spaces, but that the system that is in place, the processes that are in place, there is really no fallback if those people are not there. So there was a huge discussion a few years ago when the University of Pristina set up a Title IX sort of policy against sexual harassment. And that also does not really include in any way kind of the hate speech that students, particularly trans and gay students and queer students overall, experience within like these institutional settings. I was a sociology student myself. And so that was like, you'd consider that in in a discipline, in a field where you'd have to engage with these ideas because they're part and parcel of what's going on in our discipline, there'd be more room for these discussions, but there isn't. On the other hand, again, as I mentioned, there's kind of summer programs on gender studies and sexuality studies that are organized in cooperation with the University of Pristina. So there are these slivers of hope, but I think what we need to do next is like to turn these like temporary safe spaces, let's call them that, into institutionalized processes that are included within the universities and then within high schools and elementary schools. And that process is lengthier, of course. And in the public domain, there has been a lot of resistance with regards to acknowledgement of queer rights. I often feel like our parliament is okay with doing so only if it's like done in working groups that are closed. So in 2015, we passed a very progressive gender equality law, which actually recognizes gender identity as something as something different from medically observed sexual identity by birth, whatever. So like we have a very progressive legal framework that only happened sort of outside of the public limelight. And the moment that it becomes public, then you have quite conservative forces in society speaking up and voicing their opinions, and they're quite literally very much against acknowledging further acknowledgement of human rights. And the same goes for the Constitution. So I think there needs to be a lot of more work to create institutional processes, I'd say. So to not rely on the optimism that singular initiatives provide, but to create, like to work with institutional processes to create like this consistent change. And of course, the activists and the many feminist organizations that worked with legislative processes have exactly done that. And it's a very like long uphill battle, sort of.
I would like to connect, Aleksa, maybe with you a bit and about an important discussion, I think, that the book brings, and one that we have been witnessing also more globally as well. And I think that there's this attempt to dispute trans women's rights, in particular, to identify as women. And this has been happening also, according to you, within branches of feminist movements, more specifically trans-exclusionary feminism. How do you see this? Where do you see this rooted in the region? This exclusion of trans lives or trans voices? Because I know that it goes, for example, in Serbia, even at the beginning of the 2000s, 2005, when there were organizations for pride, there was this tendency to exclude trans voices, especially in those moments that were considered a very important moment in the early 2000s for the movement to make itself visible. So where do you see it rooted, and also how can current feminist and human rights movements open up more to trans lives?
I must explain first that the transgender community was always present, of course, in life, but the trans community wasn't visible. And this community became visible in the post-Yugoslav space in the last 10 years, as Laura said. And it was practically in the same time when it became visible globally, especially in the USA and in Great Britain, in media, actually. In their media. And in that period of time, of course, thanks to the internet, a lot of non-governmental organizations and also informal activist groups were formed in our region. Those groups are formed to promote rights of transgender and gender non-binary and intersex people, of course. And for example, in the post-Yugoslav states, in addition to already existing LGBTIQ organizations, there were 9 new trans organizations were formed in that period of time. So one of them, Trans Network Balkan, as I mentioned, is a regional organization, or other is a local organization. So that increase in the visibility of transgender people in the media, in the non-government sector, of course, provoked somehow transphobia in general public, in institutions, and of course in some leftist and feminist circles in this region, especially in Serbia, and we have a lot of examples in Croatia. So we are now dealing with this problem, and as we said, the institutions are closed for us most of the time, but we try to connect with the individuals from those institutions. So Trans Network Balkan formed the Trans Feminist Platform as an answer to that anti-gender narratives and that exclusionary practice. And that platform gathers around 50 individuals from the region, from Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia, etc. And those are people who are active in academia, in feminist circles, in other social justice movements in this region. So this is a place for sharing resources and researching anti-gender activities which happen throughout the region. So we are with this joint action and with this cooperation, we are trying to answer to those initiatives who are trans-exclusionary in this space.
And what about, Jura, how do you see this in Kosovo? Because actually you bring this also in the text, in the book as well. I think trans voices have been very present, and they've been very much also been the faces, let's say, of the movement in the past 10 years. So while we see them very much present, let's say, in the LGBTIQ plus movement, there's less of an intersection maybe with the feminist movement when it comes to speaking about trans women's lives and trans women's voices.
I mean, it's interesting, I think, because in Kosovo, like at least from my understanding, is that we don't have that factionalism within feminism yet that would be really specifically gender critical or whatever. And every time I've seen discussions that veers towards gender critical stances, they're usually feminist arguments picked up by conservative opinion makers or writers who then like deploy them to in some kind of a weird paranoia against cancel culture. So I haven't really seen, at least in and this is, we're very lucky about this, I haven't seen the kind of factionalism within our own feminist movements, which in any case is not, it's not univocal. I haven't seen that kind of factionalism in Kosovo. And there definitely when it comes to like the public activism that, for example, Lert and Len do, who they're the primary kind of the primary activists within the overall LGBTQI plus movement, and they themselves often refer to it as one community, because in Kosovo, it's obviously we're talking about a smaller group of people whose solidarity encompasses beyond their own particular identities. They have been vocal, and it's true that they're both trans men, but in my experience and from the interviews that I've done with them and from their representations and everywhere, they're super aware of the privilege of their status, and they're constantly they're denoting this kind of intersectional issue that they are in a kind of relatively privileged position where they, as trans women, as trans men, can speak more than trans women can. So we've obviously also seen cases of trans women, and one of them I talk about in the chapter, which is the case of Aleksandra Krasniqi, who came out and transitioned publicly in 1978. And we obviously can see in that case how very different the experience of transitioning in public is for a trans woman rather than for a trans man. And this ties in obviously to other further cultural proclivities and context, and also just to basically very simplistic patriarchal values. But I think it is truly the case that what we're seeing now, especially with younger activists, they are trying to build the kind of a more intersectional approach to their criticism, to their activism. And I think at least from my own experience from interviewing, and particularly I have to say this is true about Len, because we discussed with him at great length why was I writing this chapter, because we were constantly thinking about this as well, like the positionality of my own as a researcher vis-a-vis the interviews that I was doing, and then his own positionality vis-a-vis the community that he was representing publicly and trying to advocate for. So I feel like there is a growing attention and consciousness about the intersectionality of these issues, and I do feel I am optimistic about that, to be honest. So, one, I'm very happy that we are not seeing this factionalism within our own feminist movement, and two, I'm happy that the activists that are very outspoken are really aware of the conditions that make it possible for them to be outspoken.
I think there's also another layer or another point of intersection, actually, in the case of Aleksandra, the trans woman from 78 that you write about, that you found a story about in the Daily Ridinja of the time. I think it's also the issue of race, because she was also Roma, and that adds another, let's say, degree of oppression, if I may call it as such. So to what extent the movements today in the region are also taking into account other identity markers such as class and race in their discussions?
I'm less knowledgeable about the region overall, but to my understanding, at least from what I know from Kosovo and Albania as well, I think they are, absolutely. And I think one of the other cases that is very public, so as I said before, we've had this we had an entertainment sort of consumption of the trans narratives even long before trans issues became an activist issue in the region, if we want to call it that. And this is also the case in Kosovo when you had the media kind of the scandalous coverage of Edona James, who is a trans woman from like Kosovo German trans woman, and also who became famous for some kind of an affair with a football star. I can't really remember the details, but the point is that like we have almost like a diptych, like you have the case of Edona James, and then you have the case of Cherkica, who has been, who is also Roma trans, Nashkali trans woman, and who has been sort of a pillar to the queer community in Kosovo, even before the war, and particularly the immediate post-war period, because she has been kind of like, she organized queer parties, and like she put on what we would call now drag shows, which she didn't call that way, right? And so we had an interview as that, we had a profile of her in Kosovo 2.0 actually, that was written by Dardan Zhegrova. So you have like these specific kind of appearances and reappearances, but it's, again, absolutely there is a dimension to, there is a racial dimension to all of this. And it is absolutely true. And I think this is, I hope that I indicated a bit of that in the chapter as well, the way that, for example, the case was treated in Slovenia in 1978, it also had a racial dimension for it as well. So it is unlucky that the way that we kind of, the access that we have to the information about the case of the transition of missing Krasnice to Alexandra Krasnice is also kind of interpreted through a very problematic lens of the journalists that covered in Rilindia. But still, like, we get access to some of the kind of these elements that there are expectation, and then there are also prejudice involved. Absolutely.
And Aleksa, how do you see this in the regional context? And I also, when I was reading Dura's text in particular, it made me think of also the LGBTQ plus movement in the US, that it was actually started by trans women and by Black lesbians. And those stories were also not erased, I cannot say, because actually it's interesting because there is also Marsha P. Johnson, and who just a year ago now there's like a statue of her in New York City that was finally built just to remember, because she was a very vocal voice as a Black trans woman for the movement. So sometimes these movements that become very big also start from individuals that have a few layers of oppression that they live through in their societies. How do you see this in the region?
First, I must say that in this British edition of our book, we tried actually to include text about Roma trans women, and we didn't succeed in it. But in a translated edition, which is published this month in Zagreb, Mama published it. And we have an interview with a Roma trans woman, which is very, very important, because in our activism, in regional trans activism, we are one of our main values are considering intersectionality and every identity that a person possibly could have. So this is very, very much important for our book, and it is actually a pity that we do not have it in a British edition, but we we do not have that omission in a regional edition, in a translated edition. So I think this is actually very important. In this region, a long time there was a problem with the lack of trans women in activism. Especially in, I could say in Serbia, maybe in Croatia also. But now times are changing, and we have more and more trans women in trans activism, and they are very important. Their voices are very important, and we couldn't do it properly without them by our side. So I'm very happy for that, and I think that. Also, we will try to include also Roma trans women in our activism, because they are also important, and because without that dimension, we could not succeed what we want to succeed in our work, in our activist work, and of course in academic work with those books and publications.
Thank you. And a last question for both of you, and more I would like to focus maybe on the media, because it's a field you're both engaged with. And I guess, I mean, we're quite aware that like mass culture, popular culture largely reproduces and maintains patriarchal dichotomies, but there are also opportunities for mass culture production to serve as an avenue, a space where such oppressions are challenged. Do you see this happening at all today, or the possibility of this happening in the region? How can popular forms of, let's say, cultural production actually lead to a different type of knowledge about trans lives? Dura, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think if there have been any like cases of such productions. What I think for me, what was really interesting, and I think that was a really important move that that Lend did, was that he was initially, for a very brief time, he did document his own transition on YouTube, and I think that is a different kind of media that you can still consider as important and to make that effect, because through his short videos he was not only providing information for people who might want to do that or like don't really know that much about the process and probably have a lot of anxiety and questions, but he was also trying to actually kind of introduce it to the wider audience, to the process, and to normalize the process that is considered like really maybe even like hermetically closed and something like very medical and probably not tangible or easily to grasp. So I think like those kind of interventions absolutely do make an impact. They make these topics that are so relevant for people's lives part of the kind of the normal discourse, the mainstream discourse, right? And don't, because I think like whereas books like this are kind of maybe important for posterity, and in 10 years when Aleksa goes back to these books and sees that all the terminology is terrible now and we need to change it, like I think it's important for that moment in time, but it really like in terms of like the impact that books like this have like in the direct community are probably smaller than what you can do if you have like the direct contact between activists and just people in general. And I don't only mean the queer community. I also think just the general population needs to be kind of just familiarized with lives. And I again, I'm always like mentioning Blert and Land, because like in Kosovo, they have done that kind of work. They've really put themselves out there and their stories out there to actually try to do that.
And Aleksa, how do you see this?
I think that is actually very important for our community to produce our own content and to take over that representation, because only in that way we could represent adequately our community and ourselves. I'm also writing about this in my text about performance masks, which happened in Montenegro, in Croatia, and in Serbia. It is the same performance, which is first place in Montenegro, and then borrowed from other activist groups in the region. And it is very, very important because trans activists, made that script and performed it publicly, and it was all over the news in Montenegro, which is very, very positive. And I must say that our the greatest danger of when it comes to the representation in our region is from a mass media, from printed newspapers, online newspapers. They are very, very transphobic, and they are not just using adequate terminology. They're trying to spread transphobia, to spread the trans panic, and to speak negatively about trans community and about trans persons. So our activist initiatives in these challenging times are focused on producing our own texts, our our own videos about, like Laura said, about personal transitions, about our activist work. For example, one of the products of a trans feminist platform is a magazine. So this is the first trans feminist magazine here in the region, and this magazine will be published twice a year. We will release the second number in this December. So this is very important, that cooperation with all of these individuals from trans community, from feminist community, from academia, from other organizations. This is very important for us to have, new models of representation, new knowledge about transgender activism, about transgender lives, and about transgender art. Because, for example, that magazine is very focused on art production inside the community. We have people who are writing books, who are writing texts, who are painters, who are graphic designers, and who are musicians. So we are trying to promote them and to present them to public, because our community, as any other, consists of really various people with various interests and various talents, and people should see this, and not just celebrities who are transgender, who has their own stories, and or we are only see in the media, like in black pages about murders, about we in a mass media we only see that kind of sad life of a transgender person. So this is actually not true, and we have more positive. We need to have more positive stories in public, not just because of the general public, because of our community, because we need positive to see positive lives and positive outcomes of lives of transgender persons.
And that's, I think, a very beautiful point to end in. Aleksa and Laura, thank you so much for this great conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Other Talking Points is a K2.0 podcast. You can listen to it regularly on our website, kosovo2.0.com, or by subscribing to Kosovo 2.0 on Spotify.